If you are in a same-sex marriage and gave your life to Jesus, what should you do now? How can you teach your child a biblical worldview when your spouse isn't a Christian? What should you do when your spouse is not a believer and you feel spiritually lonely? How does a wife respect her husband when he's making really bad choices? Join us today for session 4 with Dr. Sean McDowell with our Questions Marriage Conference. Did I even say that right?
You nailed it.
Marriage Question Conference. Join us for that coming up. All right, welcome back to session 4 with Dr. Sean McDowell is here, and we are super excited to have him. And okay, so I wanted to start off this section and talk about, this is going to be about like unequally yoked, or just we're kind of sort of going down that path. So can you just like start off by encouraging people who have maybe spouses that are unequally yoked, maybe not a Christian, maybe not, whatever. Encourage those, because it's hard to live in a relationship with someone when they don't even think like you. So.
Yeah, in this session, we're going to jump into some of these dynamics. And the Bible doesn't answer all the questions of how to live unequally yoked. Clearly, God's design is that our relationships would be equally yoked. But sometimes people get married, they're not believers, one becomes a believer. I've met couples who both are believers and one stops believing. So these are difficult scenarios to navigate. What we're going to look at this session is a lot of principles about how to approach this when the Bible doesn't address it directly. Things like leading by example, things like prayer, things like building relationships with our kids and having a long-term perspective, and learning what it means to love a spouse when we find ourselves in maybe an unideal situation that we signed up for. Didn't catch God by surprise. God's Spirit is with us, not the challenge we would have asked for, but the one that God has for us. And let's respond with grace and respond with truth.
So it can be done.
Absolutely, it can be done.
Yeah.
No question about it.
Yeah. All right, question 1, and just so you know, you need to go to Sean McDowell's website, because you do a lot of things on marriage. You do a lot of things on homosexuality, transgender, like a lot of things. There's so much information on there. And so I was listening to some of your stuff, and I'm like, you do such a great job with it. So let's bring that, because now we have to deal with same-sex marriages. Like that's just, it used to not be a thing, and now it's kind of a thing. So let's just say somebody is in a same-sex marriage and then they come to Christ. So what happens then? Like, should they get a divorce, or do they even need to get a divorce, because it's really not, like, the marriage is not really sanctioned by God. It's not his original design. So talk about that.
Yeah, you might be watching this, you might be sitting here thinking, this doesn't relate to me, this is not my marriage. But can I tell you, this is not an academic question anymore. Yeah. If this is not you personally, I can't tell you how many parents I meet with kids who enter into a relationship like this, with friends, with neighbors, with coworkers. We have to be equipped to handle and address an issue like this. Now, before we go any further, we also have to approach an issue like this with such gentleness and with such kindness. I'm a professor, so there's times where I look at issues academically, and my wife is like, take a step back. These are real people. And in this issue, it'd be easy to approach something like this because it's so politically charged and politically debated. Realize that if this really is a person in a same-sex union and they're coming to Christ, how much it will cost them to take seriously what Scripture says about marriage. Now, Jesus says to all of us, pick up your cross, and be willing to die, follow after me. But in this case, if somebody is in a same-sex marriage, they've wanted the same things that we all want. You want companionship, you want love, you want someone to be there with you through the thick and through the thin. To the end of your life, you want a life partner. So I can't imagine how much somebody who's in a same-sex marriage is going through thinking, if I follow Jesus, what this might mean for our relationship. So with that in mind, we have to approach couples with compassion and with kindness, because this could be a very painful, tricky scenario to work through. With that said, a number of years ago, it was actually in 2015, where there was the Obergefell versus Hodges Supreme Court ruling that made same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states. There was a lot of discussion and debate about what to call same-sex marriage. Is it gay marriage? Is it same-sex marriage? Is it genderless marriage? And there's a term that I chose not to use because I didn't think it would advance a constructive conversation, but I actually think biblically it best describes what we've come to call same-sex marriage. And I'm probably going to get some hate and anger for this, but what I would accurately call it is pseudo-marriage. You can't actually marry somebody of the same sex. It's not marriage. Now, you can get a marriage certificate that says you're married. You can have a ceremony. We can use the term marriage. But if God is the creator of the universe, and he has made us male and female, and marriage is a sexed institution, then a man and a man or a woman and a woman cannot get married. And I could give reasons, biblically and non-biblically, why I think marriage is a sexed institution. Every time it's talked about, from Genesis all the way to the maps. I used to think the maps were inspired when I was a kid. All the way through Revelation, marriage is presented as a sexed institution. So we can call it marriage, but it's not actually a marriage. So if you can't actually be married, then you can't actually get a divorce. Now, legally, you have to work through the realities of what this entails, because according to the state, you are married, so to speak. But friends, it's not actually a marriage. So what Jesus would have you do is end that relationship as a public marriage and move forward in a different relationship. That's what I think Scripture teaches. Now, I understand this gets thorny and gets difficult when kids are involved. I'm not pretending this is simple. I don't have all the solutions how to do this. But if you ask the question, even for kids, what does it mean to show sacrifice to them? What does it mean to be obedient to what Jesus calls me to be as a follower of Christ? It would be to end that marriage and to enter into a different kind of relationship. So some people will not be happy with that, and I don't have a simple solution. Now, if somebody comes to Christ and they're in a same-sex union, the worst thing we can say, maybe not the worst thing, but a very unhelpful thing would be, you got to get divorced right now. Let's do this. I would say, slow down. Let's be patient. Let's let the Spirit work in somebody's heart. Realize how much is at stake relationally, financially, so many different components. But be there to lovingly support and help somebody through this transition so they can really live the way that Jesus would want them to live.
It seems like it comes down a lot to what it really truly means to follow Christ. And I think a lot of times we miss that. You know what I mean? It's like we're being taught that, just Jesus just wants to make me happy. And I think that's a tough situation, what you just talked about. But I think what you said was completely biblical, and that has to be our final authority. So good job on that. Number 2, how can I teach my kids a biblical worldview when my spouse is not a Christian? That's a tough one.
So I love the way you said that. It's tough, but not impossible. I'd be lying to you if I said, oh, it's easy, no problem, do these 3 things, pass on a biblical worldview to your kids. It's hard enough when both are Christians to pass on a biblical worldview. So it's tough. Sometimes just recognizing the truth going into this, we can have expectations and move forward. So what might this look like? One, something you've heard Alan and Mike and I say a few times is leading by example. Leading by example. So your spouse is not going to seriously consider your faith if they don't see something different in your life. And the same with your kids. Mm-hmm. If they don't look up at you and see your life being attractive, they're not going to be compelled to it. People often ask me in my own life, why are you a Christian? And one piece is I think it's true, but a huge piece is I looked at my parents' lives and I saw authenticity, I saw passion, I saw a kind of life that was attractive to me. And so it drew me to those kinds of ideas. So the first, really the biggest thing is just say, am I living a life where I'm faithful to Jesus in my priorities, in my language, in my time, that would be attractive to my son or my daughter? Model number one. Number two, build relationships with your kids. Truth is always passed on best through relationships. So spend time with your kids, do stuff with your kids. I'll sit in the jacuzzi with my older son because that's what he wants to do. My daughter wants me to come watch volleyball. My youngest son wants me to read with him. I love spending time with my kids. In fact, I'm not staying tonight because I said if I'm coming to a marriage conference, I can only be gone one night, going back to tuck my kids in and see them tonight. So build that relationship with your kids. Third, obviously be praying for our sons and our daughters. And one specific prayer I would have is that God would bring other people into their life that can model and mentor what it means to be a Christian. I pray this for my kids all the time, is God, bring in a coach, bring in a teacher, a youth pastor, a neighbor, because it's really interesting. You have like these heroes in movies, and sometimes they need the mentor, the Mr. Miyagi, the Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's not a parent, to teach the same kind of things. I needed that in my own life. So pray for your kids, but pray that God would bring in somebody specifically to play that role for them. A couple other things is all studies show that I have seen. I've done a lot of research on statistics about passing on the faith. And a more recent study by Christian Smith, who's a sociologist at the University of Notre Dame. He wrote a book called Handing Down the Faith. And he said, since the 1970s, the sociological data has been clear. Parents play the biggest role in the life of kids, more than Netflix, more than the educational system, etc. But the most effective way parents pass on their faith, number one, they have to model it. And number two, meaningful spiritual conversations in the context of relationships. Meaningful spiritual conversations. And here's just one quick example of what this might look like. And you could do this whether your kids are believers, your spouse is a believer or not. My son just turned 18. When he was 14, he wanted to see this movie Bohemian Rhapsody. And it's about the rock band
Queen.
Oh, now you participate when I talk about Queen. I get it. About the rock band Queen. And I had a little bit concerns about it, but overall I'm like, it's PG-13, and I think he's old enough to see this. So I said, hey, buddy, I'm happy to take you and a friend, pay for everything. When we're done, I just want to have a conversation with you. What you thought about the movie, what you saw, what you agreed with, maybe some concerns. So he goes, sure. So we go to the movie, sit back, probably 20, 30 minutes. I just asked him questions. I didn't lecture. I said, hey, what was your favorite scene? What'd you think about the movie? As Christians, what can we agree with? And I said, are there any times you felt preached at? Any times you felt like the Bible would disagree with what was there? And we just talked about it. Meaningful spiritual conversation, studies show, is the best way to pass on faith. And the last thing, send your kids to Summit Ministries. I'm not on staff with Summit Ministries, but I speak for them. It's 2 weeks that if I could give one advice to all parents to help kids solidify their faith, it'd be send them to Summit. So in sum, lead by example, build relationships with your kids, pray for them that God would bring in others into their life, have spiritual conversations, and seriously, send your kids to Summit.
Tell us about Summit. So it's for high school
Sure.
or college?
It's for roughly 16 to 25 years old. It's 2 weeks. I'll go in and teach for them, and it's pretty in-depth worldview, biblical training, but there's a lot of relational, fun things they do as well. And if I could give parents one advice to pass on their faith, it really would be to send their kids to Summit.
Will you also go back? I was listening to you one time, and this always stuck in my brain. It's something you did with one of your kids. I don't know if you were at the fair and you're walking along, and there was a Jehovah's Witness, or there was something? Okay, will you share that? Because that was really impactful, because I think for most of us, when our kids are like, oh, I want to learn about that religion, we're like, no, you can't do that. But you didn't do that. To explain how you're helping your kids get a biblical worldview.
Yeah, we were up at Hume Lake, just a beautiful camp I was speaking at for the week, and we were out on a hike, on a walk with some friends, and we were walking by this Jehovah's Witness booth. And they were giving out literature like Jehovah's Witnesses do. And my son walked up, he showed interest, didn't know what it was, and a friend of mine's kids went up. And a friend of mine was kind of like, hey, don't grab that, it's false literature. I told my son, I'm like, grab it. Let's talk about it. He was interested. He was intrigued. Here's a chance to talk with my kid. He had interest in what Jehovah's Witnesses believe. I'm like, grab the material. I'm not intimidated by this. I said, open it up. What does it say about hell? What does it say about Jesus? What do we agree with? Do you see anything we disagree with? See, they believe salvation by works. So the Bible doesn't teach that. This is what we call a cult. To me, that was an opportunity to teach my kids something rather than something to shy away from. So you might think about it in more contemporary terms. I want to inoculate my kids with a vaccine, so to speak, a little bit, what you might say, of a, not so much a disease, but a spiritual disease. So they develop the antibodies to be, in defense of the real thing.
I love that, because I think that's how we're going to teach our kids, but it's really hard. But not all of us are like you. Like, I'd be like, I'd probably have anxiety over that. So that's why I need to come to Biola, and you can
do it.
Yeah. All right, number 3. My husband is not a Christian and really thinks people should love who they want to love. How should I respond if one of my kids comes out as an LGB? There's just too many of those letters now. LGBTQ. So what do you do? You're a Christian, but your husband's like, oh, I'm sorry, we just got to go with it.
Recently, I had a chance to interview a woman who described herself as like the OG YouTube lesbian creator, has over 700,000 subscribers, has been doing this like a dozen years, not a Christian, doesn't claim to be a Christian. Reached out to her and I said, would you be willing to just have a conversation with a Christian on my YouTube channel? And she totally agreed. It was a fascinating conversation. Now, I asked all the questions, but I told her at the beginning, I said at the end, I'm going to just allow you, if you want to ask me anything you'd want to ask a Christian professor. I didn't have a clue what she was going to ask. So get to the end, I said, hey, do you have any questions for me? And she asked this question. She said, me and my community would want to know, how would you respond if one of your kids came out as gay? And what I presume she didn't know is a week before, I had just done a bunch of social media posts thinking about this, so it was fresh in my mind. Now, before I give the answer, some of the best parenting advice I got from my dad is he goes, son, I used to think ahead of time of the kinds of scenarios I might find myself in as a parent and how I would respond, so in that moment I can show grace. How would I respond if my daughter came to me and said, I'm pregnant? How do I respond if you came to me and said, Dad, I'm high on pot and I enjoy it? What do I do if you said I'm dropping out of school? What if I came to you and said I'm gay? So there's some powerful parenting wisdom in thinking this through ahead of time so we can respond and not be caught off guard. So when she asked me that, I'd already thought of it. And I looked at her, I said, if one of my kids came out and said they're gay, I'd look at them, I'd say, thank you so much for trusting me with this part of your life. I can only imagine you've been thinking about this for a long time and probably had some fears about how your dad might respond, given that I've written a book and been outspoken on a biblical view of this. You know I love you, but probably have some fears. Like, thanks for trusting me with that piece of your life. Second, I love you. You're my son or my daughter. There's nothing you could say or nothing you could do that would ever cause me to stop loving you, period, end of story. And third, we'll work this through together. And Ariel, she goes, wow, that was beautiful. Send me the link when it's out. I want to share it with my community, which was pretty cool. So let me take a step back and add a couple things. What if your kids have already come out to you and you didn't respond the way that you wanted to? You can't change that. But you could go back to your son or daughter and just say, you know what? When you came out to me, I didn't respond the way I wish that I had. I wish I could take it back. I said, you probably thought about this for a long time. That's the first time I heard it, and it just caught me off guard. I'm not giving excuses, but if I could go back, here's what I would say differently. I think that's totally fair, and most people are going to appreciate and are going to value that. Now, that's an initial response. The trick comes when you start, as this question says, what if you have a spouse who's in favor of this and says you're not loving your kid if you're not affirming, and yet you have a hard time being affirming? I got this question about 5 or 6 months ago in an online class that I was teaching. A woman said to me with tear-filled eyes, and I don't remember if it was her son or daughter, she said, my child is transitioning and my husband is totally affirming. And as a mom, I can't get on board with this. And my daughter is saying to me, or my son, I just don't remember, if you don't get on board with this, I never want to see you again. When I heard that, I was pretty much in tears myself, putting myself in the position of that mom, like, oh, I can't imagine this. So I just asked her a few questions. I said, why aren't you on board with this? And she basically had a biblical understanding of marriage, biblical understanding that our gender and biology are meant to go together. And I said, your motherly instincts, you might be the last voice at this season speaking truth into your son or daughter. I don't want you to be coerced and forced into this by some other narrative. Your motherly instincts are right. Lovingly resisting this, I think, is the right thing to do. And in the long term, you're going to have a clear conscience knowing you did what was right before the Lord. I said, with that said, I don't know how your husband's going to respond. I don't know how your daughter's going to respond. I said, but I would go with your motherly instincts because it's really the truth that sets free. That'd be my response on this. So, one last thing I would say. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had, dozens, because I've written and spoken on this issue. People just reach out to me and want counsel. And oftentimes it's people that say, I need a biblical argument to prove to my kids that transgender is not biblical. I need an argument to prove to my kids they shouldn't get into a same-sex marriage. And I can't tell you how many times I've said this. I said, let me challenge you to reframe the question. Rather than trying to convince your son or daughter of a certain position, your job is to convince your son or daughter of your love. Doesn't mean compromise truth, but there's a way to hold both. I think that's how we have to respond.
Now, you have a couple books on this. You've written books on what name?
I wrote a book just called Same-Sex Marriage,
Okay.
A Thoughtful Biblical Approach to Marriage. I think that's the subtitle. It's funny, I forget, but the title is Same-Sex Marriage. But I more recently wrote a book called Chasing Love for kids, and a lot of adults have read it, just to have these conversations with students on all issues of sexuality, but transgender, same-sex marriage, etc.
I'm so glad we're not raising kids in this generation. It's weird, like our last one's 25, and that I'm so thankful because this is a really hard time period to be having children.
It is tough.
It's terrifying.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, please. do.
Just here's the way I try to frame this. And I know it's different, but when I was about 12 years old, my dad was literally heading up the first global sexual purity campaign in the 80s. It was called Why Wait? Some of you might remember this. Mm-hmm. Nobody globally dealt with a lot of the fallout from the sexual revolution. So my dad's writing books, becoming, famous, and I'm like 12 and my hormones are kicking in. And I remember I went to my dad and I was like, Dad, what would happen if I got a girl pregnant? And I'll never forget his response. He got down on a knee, he looked me in the eyes, he goes, son, I don't care if the whole world called me hypocrite. You and I would work it through together.
Aww.
It's not about us. The question is, what is the right, loving thing for our kids rooted in Scripture? And how do we live that out?
Yeah. That's awesome. Okay. I always feel like we should be like, amen, pray and go, just because that was really good. Okay. The next one it's probably just a one question answer. Someone was confused on marriage. Is marriage something you have to go through the court? Or let's just say two people are like, we love each other and we went by the pond out here and we decided to just say our vows. Like, what does it say legally? Like, in God's eyes, it would or would not be considered.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
So I could probably come up with some historical example where you'd say, those people don't have a courts. Here's a way, like, you don't need the courts to get married. I could probably come up with some historical exception to this. The bigger question we need to ask is, what is God's intention for marriage? What's the purpose of marriage? Marriage is not meant to be a private affair. It is a public institution. That's a part of God's design for marriage. So even when a man leaves his father and mother, clings with his wife, we now have two households that are distinct, interacting in the public arena. And as we talked about earlier, the purpose of marriage at its heart is to portray God's love for his church to the world through a human relationship. So I think when we look at it through this as a public institution, my question would be, why wouldn't we want to go through the courts? And of course you could add certain obedience to the state with limits in Romans 13 and 1 Peter, that I don't frankly understand why somebody wouldn't want to go through the courts, all things considered. There's no compromise in the nature of marriage by saying I'm going to get married through the courts. Now, just a few questions to think about. If you choose not to get married through the courts, what example is this setting to your kids, to other non-believers, to your grandkids? Is it an example you want them to follow, or an example you don't want them to follow? And I would suspect that the vast majority of you, upon reflection, would want your kids to have a public celebration and to make this relationship formal. That's what we'd want for them. And by the way, have you ever thought about why the government cares about marriage but doesn't care about, like, your tennis partner? Because when you get married, you buy property. It actually intersects with certain legal issues. And so it's a lot easier to get married than it is to get divorced. And that's the way a society should be. It's actually built that way. So a few questions. If you don't go through the courts and presumably make this public, again, what example are you giving to your kids? Mm-hmm. Do you want them to just say, well, I'm married in God's eyes privately? And I often said to students, I said, look, if it's just a marriage certificate before you get married, it's going to just be a marriage certificate after you get married. So given that marriage is a public institution, that we're called to obey the government, that people understand marriage as having a particular license within our culture, that getting married legally can make divorce harder, but it builds in some kind of accountability that should be there, I don't know why somebody wouldn't want to go through the courts. I just have to be given a really good argument, and I can't think of one why that would be a wise move to do.
Perfect. Okay, this next question I actually really liked because, when you have unequally yoked marriages, a lot of times the Christian spouse wants to get out. They're like, I just can't handle it. My husband. So this person writes, I love my husband, even though he's not a Christian, and this could be husband, or you could be like, I love my wife if you're a husband. Even though, let's just say husband, he's not a Christian. I want to be the best wife to him in hopes that he will come to Christ, okay? But what's so difficult in this marriage is I can't talk to him about spiritual things. He doesn't pray with me. We can't pray for our kids. And she said, I feel so spiritually lonely. And I was so proud of her because I'm like, good job that you care that much for your spouse. But it's very lonely for someone, in that kind of a situation.
I would completely affirm that your feelings are legitimate.
Yeah.
Like, I get it. Not because I'm in that marital relationship, but I have a lot of friends, a lot of people I've talked to who feel this way. And you are unmistakably, absolutely not alone. That's natural. Like, if your deepest commitment is to Jesus and that's a part of who you are, and you're married to somebody, you want to share that. So we can't pray together, read the scriptures together. Like, of course you're going to feel a kind of void that I think we are meant to experience in a marriage. So I get that you would feel that way. It's natural. You're certainly not alone. And you've heard us say this a few times on stage. The difficult truth is you can't force your spouse to care about spiritual things. Again, Jesus let the rich young ruler walk away. He let him walk away. So I know somebody who's hearing this is wanting to say, Sean, tell me 2 or 3 things I can do to get my spouse. And I can't. I can't fix that for you. But I think there's a few things we can say that could maybe help. One thing is I would work even harder, maybe double your efforts, to find other ways to feel close to your spouse. Whatever that may be for you. Maybe you like to fish together. Maybe like us, you like to run together. Maybe you knit. I don't know. Maybe you watch Mike Winger videos together. I've heard that brings couples together in a unique, powerful way. That's just the word on the street. I don't know what that is, but I would encourage you to say, you know what? I can't have this spiritual side. So it's not like I'm going to find something else to fill that spiritual void, because you probably can't fill that spiritual void with your spouse. But you can find other ways to connect, to build up that relationship, to have a deep, intimate, close relationship, even if it's not the spiritual depth that your heart yearns for. Another thing to keep in mind is find other people who feel the same way that you do. I don't know what Facebook group or social media groups there are for people whose spouses aren't believers, but I guarantee you they're out there. There's probably some YouTube channels committed just to spouses who are not believers. There might be a meeting at church. What's so hard about this is you feel alone because you don't have that spiritual relationship, and it's that loneness that just feels painful. One of the great ways is just to find other people who are like, I'm there, I get it, and who can pray with you, who can understand. Now, one caution just would be, make sure you don't do that in a secretive way, that if your spouse finds you're part of some Facebook group, feels like they are betrayed. I've seen this happen and it ends up doing worse. So if you do this, just think through a creative, respectful way to just communicate to your spouse, lovingly and caringly, and saying, you know what, I just want you to know I'm thinking about joining this group just so people understand, and get your spouse's feedback.
Perfect. Okay, the next one is this is because like we're supposed to respect our husbands and as Christian women, but for this scenario, this girl, her husband's not a Christian, and so it's very difficult to respect him because he's making really poor choices. So I'm drinking too much. I'm gambling. I'm whatever you're doing, and you just, I'm like, I can't even respect you. I don't even like you. Like, you know what I'm saying? So how does a Christian woman respect? What does respect look like in a relationship or a marriage like that?
So you definitely don't have to respect all of his choices.
Okay.
So please know that respecting doesn't equal I affirm all the choices that you're making. You can respect somebody and still disagree with and take issue with the choices that you're making. Respect is more of an attitude and an approach. So I think of the times that my wife has not been happy with things I've said or things I've done or things I've not done and felt the need to, let's just say, confront me to deal with these issues. And by the way, what's interesting is I tend to have the personality that's like poker face, think about this, philosophize forever, and my wife like wears her emotions on her sleeve and doesn't hide stuff. And there's probably a strength and weaknesses to both sides. But what's interesting is the times she has come to me with an issue, it's amazing as I reflect back how respectful she's chosen to be. So she disagreed with something I said, whatever it was, an action I took, but chooses to try to approach me with respect, even though she has taken issues, rightly so, with the choice I made or words that I speak. Now, this shouldn't just be between Christians and non-Christians. This should be in any healthy marriage. So the respectful thing, the right thing, the loving thing might be to do, to confront your husband, depending on what the issue is, of course, again, in the right way, at the right time. Now, he might say this is disrespectful, but the real question is, what's your heart? What's your approach? And how do you come across to this person? So if you don't know what this looks like in your situation, this is where you've got to bring somebody in who's wise, who knows you and knows your spouse, where you can say, here's the issue. And I know in the question they didn't clarify, maybe it's drinking, maybe it's language. You kind of got to gauge how serious of an issue is this. If it's language, that's going to be not good, but is that as bad potentially, depend on the language, as somebody who's drinking and who's drunk? Well, let's gauge this, especially if the person is a non-believer. And I would really recommend, you've got to have somebody walk you through a pastor and say, what issues do I die on? What would it look like to respectfully confront my husband on this? And that's not disrespectful to do so. So I guess my encouragement would be is the person asking this question, you're probably sitting at a point in your life thinking, this is not the mission I signed up for. This is not what I would ask for. Can't change the past. But I think a bigger question is, what does it mean to love God with a spouse who makes poor choices? And what does it mean to love your spouse? Isn't that the question Jesus would have us ask? You might say it's easy for you to say, Sean, and you know what? It probably is. But it doesn't make it not true. So how can you do this? The answer is you can't do it alone. Don't even try to do it alone. You get burned out, you'll get discouraged. You need the prayer and strength and encouragement of other believers in your life, day by day, loving this person and praying for wisdom, as James 1:5 says. So in sum, you can disagree with your husband's choices, and you should. The loving thing to do is to disagree, and at times to confront, Christian or not. But it's the attitude and approach in which we do it that makes the difference. And the biggest, most important question when it's all said and done is, am I loving my spouse and loving Jesus, even though I find myself in a marriage and a relationship I did not feel like I signed up for?
Right.
I think that's the heart of the question.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. I think we've probably touched on this, and I can't remember which session it was. I don't always feel like I love my spouse. Should I always feel like I'm in love? I think we talked about it. I can't remember now, but maybe you can just answer that.
No, you shouldn't always feel like you're in love with your spouse. Now, why would I say that? Because the idea that love is a feeling, we've talked about this, is a notebook, Hallmark, Disney idea that's infiltrated the scriptures. But I actually wonder if sometimes not having certain feelings helps us dig deeper and find out what's wrong and then commit to loving somebody better. I wonder if God allows us to go through and have certain feelings at a time as kind of doing a gut check That if I always, every moment felt like I loved my wife, would I be as committed to working on this relationship? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a fair question to ask. On the other hand, and this is an obvious point, but it has to be said, if we live our lives in any area based on our feelings, we're going to destroy our lives. You know this. My diet, if I just eat what I feel like eating, I'm going to wreck my diet on so many levels. My job, if I'm like, I just don't feel like going to work today. Well, good luck getting and keeping a job. And that's true for relationships. So feelings are beautiful. They're a gift from the Lord. God wants us to have loving feelings towards our spouse, of course. But I think the Bible gives a more objective measure of what love is than feelings. So when I was thinking about this question, I thought, you know what, let's go to some of the passages that talk about what love is. And we'll do two very briefly. Ephesians 5 we've talked about, where it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. And it says, love your wives as you love your own bodies. How do you love your own body? You nurture and cherish it, which is best, I think, translated or understood as protect and provide. So we naturally protect our bodies from harm, and we naturally act in a way to provide for our own good. We don't have to be taught this instinct, at least. We have to be taught as how to apply this instinct to others. In Ephesians 5, husbands love their wives. It doesn't mention a feeling. So you could be loving your wife in principle without having those feelings. Or you could actually have feelings like, oh, I really feel like I love my wife or my husband, but not acting in a way consistent with those feelings. So in philosophical language, having feelings of love is neither necessary nor sufficient for truly loving that person. Another example, I was reading through 1 Corinthians 13, and it talks about what love is, right? Classic passage every wedding in the history of the world has had. And I was reading this thinking, how many of these are about a feeling? Love is patient and kind. Is that a feeling? No, it's an action. It does not envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. These are actions with people. Now, it does say it does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. So it's describing that love, there are certain feelings we have not at wrongdoing, but that accompany truth. So there should be a component of emotions we'll come back to. And then it says love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love is essentially an action. So you say, gosh, this just guts the joy out of love. Should I never watch Disney again? The answer is yes. Don't watch Disney again for a different reason. No, I'm kidding. Separate issue. Here's what I think. I think God ideally wants our emotions and actions to align with one another. When they don't, this is where the spiritual disciplines come in. Is the spiritual disciplines are meant to conform our behavior, even conform our feelings to match up with what is right. So ideally, I would act in a way loving towards my wife, and I would feel loving towards my wife. So it's so fascinating. Matthew 6:21 says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Isn't that interesting? We say in the culture, follow your heart, follow your feelings. And Jesus is like, actually, where you put your treasure, your time and your energy, there your heart follows. So if you find yourself in a position where you don't feel like you love your spouse, don't beat yourself up. Say, maybe this is what God is using to reveal an area I need to better love my spouse. What can I change to cultivate a heart for my spouse? Because where my treasure is, my heart is also. When you start to do loving things, and you start to say loving things, and you invest and you work on your relationship, guess what tends to naturally happen? Then the feelings follow. That's the spiritual disciplines and why they're so important.
Perfect. I love it. Okay, How can I get my spouse to communicate with me?
You can't get your spouse to do anything.
Exactly. But think about, like, you have some people that love to talk and love to. And
I agree.
Yeah.
Let me reframe the question. Instead of how can I get my spouse to communicate with me, a better question might be, what can I do better to communicate more effectively with my spouse? You heard Mike Winger say, I can't control what somebody else thinks and feels. I can control my response. So rather than saying, how do I get my spouse to do A, B, and C, fill in the blank, a question might be, how can I communicate more effectively with my spouse? So when I was thinking about this question, there might be reasons why your spouse doesn't communicate great. One of them might be that your spouse just doesn't know how to communicate. They might not know how. It's somewhat embarrassing. Probably 10 years ago, a student of mine graduated, finished law school about a year ago, got married, and so I guess I was in like my mid-30s, and she's in my class, and she said something to my wife. She goes, what's it like to be married to somebody who's such a good communicator? My wife's response was to laugh. Now, why? Because there's a big difference between communicating on stage, writing books, and interpersonally communicating and sharing your feelings in a real, authentic way. Now, my wife laughed. I've come a long, long ways. But don't think, oh, John and Alan and Mike can make videos. That means they're great interpersonal communicators. You guys might be. I can only speak for myself. And I think back of like so much more early on. I really have come a long ways and have worked at this. But early on in our marriage, I think at times where she would sit there and would like coach me through. So what are you feeling? Maybe why are you feeling this way? Help me understand. What would you say? Say something. And I look back and I'm like, dear Lord, it was like a parent and a kid. I just had to learn how to communicate and express my feelings. And I come from a family where my parents do this well. So I only say that is that all of us have different things that come naturally to us. My wife is like, I don't want to speak on stage. I can do that. So maybe the person doesn't communicate well because they really just don't know how. And so my wife could have been like, she could have nagged. She could have been like, what's the matter with you? She could have shamed me. She didn't. She was patient. She was gracious and just lovingly helped me get better at communicating that way. It could be as simple as that. Now, it could be deeper. Your spouse doesn't know how to communicate because there's a lot of hurt and pain in their past, and they've never learned how to deal with that hurt and pain by communicating it. That's a very different issue. That's where you might need the help of a counselor, somebody outside of you to just go deeper and find out, is there a father wound? Is there whatever abuse or deeper issue that can communicate? There could be a fear of sharing certain things. So when I get a question, what do I do to get my spouse to communicate better? Partly, we just have to get to the heart of, why doesn't your spouse communicate better? Identify the problem and then, in a sense, try to fix it. So all I can say is, as a husband, I can't speak for, actually this hasn't been an issue. I've never tried to help my wife communicate better, at least interpersonally, so to speak. Is what she does is she encourages me. And again, not so much anymore. We've been married 22 years, but for a long time, she was positive, she was encouraging, she was helpful. I actually remember one time we were dating, she's like, I'm gonna ask you a question, I'm not gonna say anything. We were on the phone silent 5 minutes. I didn't even know what to say. I just sat there. And she's like, I'm not saying anything. And that was actually, looking back, a very wise way at that moment to just kind of lovingly force me to learn to communicate better. So start with your own communication. Try to figure out what's the heart of why your husband doesn't communicate. Is it fear? Is it hurt? Is it inability? Maybe the issue is he just doesn't care. But once we find what the heart of the issue is, then we can better address it, right? If you're car is out of gas. It doesn't do any good to change the spark plugs or get a new transmission. Identify it and try to deal with it. And in communication, once you can identify what it is, then you can start moving forward. And you could, I don't want to say too much more, but the times where you positively feel like your spouse did communicate well, point that out. Hey, I really appreciate that you took the time to explain this to me. That's helpful to me. I guess I'll say one more thing is I have a relationship I'm very close with. And in this relationship, in this married couple, one of them has severe, deep sexual abuse in the past and has experienced healing from this, but in some ways has affected his ability to share certain emotional truths in a way the damage is so deep. Mm-hmm. So his wife recognizes that and deals with just who he is, where he is, has fair expectations, and their marriage thrives because of it.
Perfect. All right, last question. Let's talk about jealousy really quick. I feel jealous. I don't know how to get over it. I'm jealous of the women who work with my husband, or if you're a man, like I'm jealous of the men that my wife works with. What should I do?
Well, there is a good kind of biblical jealousy. In Exodus, it says, the Lord our God is jealous. So there is a sense where we should be jealous of our spouse's attention and affection. God is jealous for us because we have been made to know and love God, and we thrive best when we are loving God. So when somebody says, I have issues of jealousy with my spouse, I want to know what kind of jealousy, because there is a good biblical jealousy that I want, and as a husband, deserve my wife's attention and affection, and vice versa. That's good. I sense this question is a little different, not like I want godly biblical jealousy. I'm jealous of my spouse's time and affection. My best guess with this is because you feel jealous because something is deeper and lacking in your relationship with your spouse. There's an insecurity that is there. And the jealousy itself, it's not a matter of the question said, I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to get over it. The question is not just how you get over this and change your emotions. The question is, how do you dissect and figure out what the root of that jealousy is and make deeper changes within your relationship? So I think if you feel jealous of your spouse's time and energy, it could be more on you that you have insecurities and unrealistic expectations, or it very well could be as well that your spouse is not giving you the love and attention and affection that you deserve. From this question alone, I don't know exactly what that is, but the feelings are secondary. The heart of the issue is, do we have a healthy relationship together where we're caring for one another, giving each other the time and affection and love that we deserve? You work on that deeper issue, and the unhealthy jealousy is going to take care of itself.